All right, well, let's get rolling. So here we go. Welcome, everybody, and Happy New Year. Thank you all for introducing yourself. Get comfortable. We'll go for a little bit under an hour, and we'll leave time for questions. But this is a really important topic, so I'm glad we can get to it. Big topic for today, the rise of millennial major donors. So this is, as we'll get to in a second, the largest generation in America. At some point, it'll be the wealthiest generation in America. It is very, very different than some of its predecessors, and it has some similarities. So we'll walk through what are the trends shaping this organization, this generation, and specifically what tactics might you, as a director of development, as a gift officer, as a plan giving officer, to be wildly successful in the face of all of these changes. So first things first, this event is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. We've seen more people get audited lately, so you want to definitely make sure you make a note. We'll post a survey in the chat at the end to receive credit, so just make sure you do that. We know a lot of folks have had their professional development budget zeroed out or close to it. So my colleague Simone, who's also here, has put a lot of work into making sure that all these are CFRE approved. So 1.0 credits, I believe it takes 15 every 3 years to get recertified. So make sure to make that note, please. So agenda today, we'll do some very quick introductions. We'll wish you a Happy New Year. We'll talk about how your week is going, and then we'll really dig into these insights around millennial giving and what you might want to do about them. And then we'll leave some time at the end for next steps and Q&A. So for everybody who's sticking with us. Quick introductions. I know a lot of you on the call, but there's a decent number of folks for whom this is our first time meeting. So my name is Patrick. I am lucky to be the co-founder and co-CEO of a company called FreeWill, alongside my wonderful co-founder, Jenny. And we're really, really excited and thrilled to work alongside the FreeWill team, which is now about 75 people, often based in New York, now scattered throughout the country, which has been really great. And we just hit $2.2 billion in terms of money raised for charity. So that's been really exciting, and we're really lucky to work alongside a lot of folks who are on this call as well. And then before we dive in, I realize that this is a really big, we're kicking off the new year in a really big year after a really hard year. And I know some folks have had really good years, but even so, it's been really challenging. One of my favorite things over the past year is this book by a guy named Adam. I actually bought this when I was at, I believe, the MoMA. It was in their gift shop back when everybody went to museums. And it's great. It's sort of a daily reflection. It is fun, it's whimsical, it's not too serious. And it's about 5 minutes to start my day. I don't do it every day, but most days. So we are going to send 20 people. I can't send everybody because that is just too much money, but we'll send 20 people this as a gift to help you have a great year. So just make a note in the survey, which we'll post in later if you'd like to send it, if you'd like us to send you a copy, and then just make sure you fill your address so we can actually send it to you. So hopefully that ends up to one of you. Okay, so how is your week going? We've asked you about this. Well, what you can see is anxiety was lower than the last time we asked. You can see this yellow trend line over time. Now, remember, the last time we asked was basically in the interim period before official certification, sort of in the week after the presidential election. You can see that that come back up a bit after December 8th. Happiness is a little bit lower. Obviously, this was a really sort of challenging week in America coming out. But it's nice to see that loneliness continue to trend down over time. It seems like a lot of people are finding ways to stick together, and hopefully this community you all a little bit happier, a little less anxious, a little less lonely. We also ask what people are worried about. And you can see this blue line, which is typically the top one, worried about hitting goals, has really come down. And my hope is that part of that means that you had a very strong end of year giving season, and you were able to really achieve that. Things like health and safety of donors, of coworkers has gone up and down as obviously the situation in the US changes. So just wanted to share this back to you to see what how your peers are feeling. And so hopefully it's gives you some sense of companionship with all the other folks on the call. All right, so that is quick intros of you, of me. Let's talk through millennials. And we actually asked you how you would describe millennials. And so here is some of those common words that you used: passion, driven, tech, engaged. Also things like entitled, self, things like social and savvy, creative, motivated, confident. Liberal is on here, committal, attention, misunderstood. A lot of really interesting ways that we're describing this generation. So I just wanted to put this out here before we get into some of the more data-driven facts. So thank you for everyone who filled out the pre-survey to help surface this information. So before we get into some of the trends, let's just understand and make sure we're all looking at the same picture here. So first things first, millennials are folks born from 1981 to 1996. So right now they're about 25 to 40 years old. There are 72.1 million millennials in the US. They recently surpassed baby boomers to be the largest American generation. So this is the largest group of American adults, right? This is the plurality, significantly bigger than Gen X, by the way, which preceded them, because the silent generation and Gen X are sort of two parts of a smaller portion, and then the boomers and millennials are much larger. They are also more educated. So 40% have bachelor's degrees or more, compared to 25% of baby boomers and 10% of silent generation. So folks that you're talking to will be at a different level and different pace. Other things to note here is they're less married. So this is a very different dynamic. 46% of millennials are married. This is compared to 57% of Gen X, 67% of boomers, 83% of the silent generation when they were at the same age. So it's not that millennials are just younger and they're not married yet. This is a big shift here. So meaningful shift. I mean, the difference between 67% of boomers and 46% of millennials is pretty outstanding. So more than half of millennials are not married. At least 25% of millennials at this pace will not have married by their mid-40s or early 50s. So a very large percentage of single people compared to the previous generation. Now, part of that is things like more equitable income. And so young women don't necessarily have to think about getting married as financial stability the way they might have in 1910. But we're seeing other different shifts as well. Other things to know is they have fewer children. So the family structure is really shifting here. In 2016, 48% of millennial women, which is age 20 to 35, were moms, compared to 57% of Gen X and 58% of boomers at the same age. So this is a pretty big shift as well. And when we get later into planned giving, but also major giving. I mean, those of you who have kids know that kids are expensive. And what it means is that the absence of kids actually means there's a lot more disposable income and some potential, some giving there. Birth rates, by the way, are significantly lower for women with advanced degrees among the millennial generation. So women with less than a high school education had 50% more children than women with graduate degrees in recent years, per the CDC. So what this means is that your donor base not only has fewer children compared to boomers, but likely many of your millennial donors are going to be more educated, therefore even fewer children than the sort of broad millennial population. So I hope we're going to start to see later in this conversation how some of these trends play out in giving types. Now, we talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago, but what we're really talking about when talking about millennial donors is what we call the Oregon Trail generation. These are folks born from 1981 to 1999. Now, your 25-year-olds aren't going to be quite major donors yet, but this group is turning 40 this year. So the Oregon Trail generation is called that because it's the last generation to remember life before the internet and before widespread cell phones. And everyone, and I'm actually part of this cohort, we all remember, we all had sort of the same experience of walking into technology before it got overwhelming. And so we all played this game called the Oregon Trail and a couple other games that were at every library computer. Someone joined from Ridgefield Library. I am 100% sure that at Ridgefield Library, there was Oregon Trail on the computer at some point. This generation, by the way, this Oregon Trail generation headed to college just as 9/11 happened, or 9/11 happened in college for the older folks. So they have a more globalist lens than early generations and are not necessarily used to the stability of sort of the roaring 80s and 90s that Gen X had. Remember the Clinton years, but they're really shaped by the Bush and Obama years. Right? Those are sort of the formative political experiences for this group. One note, by the way, and this is sort of illustrative of the difference between the two millennials. You can actually tell what type of millennial someone is when whether they're an older Oregon Trail or if they're a younger millennial. So I'll give you 20 seconds, write in the chat how you can tell what part of millennials somebody is when they take a selfie. Okay. There's a lot of duck face, which is, I vaguely know what duck face is, but doesn't answer. And a couple of folks had it, so I want to see. There it is. Emily said horizontal versus vertical, which is correct. So that's how you can actually tell. So older millennials take horizontal selfies. Let's see if my phone is here. So they take photos like this. And the reason is when we think of photos, we still think of our phones as cameras, and then a photo is something that's printed out and it's usually horizontal, right? Or it's on this sort of horizontal on a desktop. But younger millennials who take photos like this, they see their phones not only as cameras, but also the primary way photos are consumed. They have no real memory of actual cameras, right? And then using those photos to consume, on sort of the stairway going up to the upstairs bedrooms or different ways. Almost all of the photos that they ever consume are on their phone. So it's very interesting. Casey says, by the way, it makes it very difficult in videos when you need that horizontal view. That is true, but Casey, my guess is you're an older millennial, because if you're a younger millennial, you're also viewing videos like this as well. So that is a big shift. Okay, so we have these two portions. Let's talk about charitable giving. Millennials are increasingly charitable. So 84% of millennial employees give charitably, 70% of them volunteer. You actually see higher rates of participation here among millennials than among older generations. Now, part of this, frankly, is that people with higher education tend to be more charitable, and you have higher education on average among millennials than you do among preceding generations. 23% of millennials said they wanted to be known for their philanthropy and that giving was an important part of their legacy. So this really, really centers. A higher percentage of millennial millionaires donate compared to non-millennial millionaires as well. So that's an interesting aspect here. One thing that we're not going to cover, but I just want to make a quick note, millennials tend to spend way more money on experiences compared to stuff. And so when millennials have extra money, they're usually to give it away, because the trade-off and that feeling of giving it away corresponds to an experience as opposed to not stuff that they're not having, which you might see more of that in older generations. We also asked you, by the way, what percentage of your own donors are between the age of 25 and 40. Now, the biggest section here is we don't know. So some of you just didn't have access to that data on hand. 36, 0 to 20, but 28% of you said 28% said 20 to 40, and 6% of you said 40 to 60. So more than half in some cases. A very small sliver says 60 to 80. All of these numbers will be going up every year for the next 20 years. Corinne asks, how do people collect donor ages? Corinne, if you're a hospital or a college, you have better access to birth dates. Some people are also probably making their best estimates. So let's share some insights around millennial major donors to really help you get your head around this. So first, we got to understand where this money is. And just as a reminder, there are only 2 ways to become wealthy enough to become a major donor. And sure, there are a couple dozen others, but 95% of donors are going to be wealthy in one of these 2 ways. So first is you earn it, right, through compensation or investments, or you inherit it, right? What some people call the old-fashioned way to make money. So these are really the only 2 paths. So we'll talk about each in its own context and how that shapes charitable giving. We'll start by talking about the first path. So there are 646,000 millennial millionaires in the United States. It's a pretty significant number. It can make some of us feel like we're falling behind. They are heavily concentrated in urban areas, and they're heavily concentrated in 2 states. So take 1 second, pop in the chat, and tell me which 2 states you think those folks are. All right. So no one has any guesses except California and New York, which is pretty accurate. Some folks said Texas. That's not so far off. 44% of all millennial millionaires live in California. I mean, almost half. That's pretty astounding. 14% live in New York. So that's 58%. Almost 3 in 5 live in those 2 states. And then you have Florida, Massachusetts, Texas, Washington, New Jersey, Virginia, Illinois, Maryland. But it's wildly disproportionate. Now, some of this is population, right? New York and California, I believe, are 2 of the top 6 population states, and California is the largest. But a lot of it's wealth concentration. So we'll talk about this in a moment. So why California? Why are there a whole bunch of millennial millionaires. The tech boom has created a lot of millionaires, especially at tech giants. So sometimes people talk a lot about startups, but actually these companies have gotten so large that many of their ordinary employees, especially the early ones, have become millionaires. So Google, Facebook, Amazon is in this category, although obviously based in Seattle, Netflix, Uber, Airbnb, LinkedIn, et cetera. So these massive, massive companies where stock compensation is a really big component of it, and salaries have gotten increasingly competitive. So this wealth in California for these folks is in real estate. Now, remember, real estate is incredibly unlikely to be a source of giving for a millennial, right? You may have some retirees giving you a vacation home they don't use anymore, or real estate being left in a will. Among older donors, it is very, very unlikely that you're going to get an apartment in San Francisco from a millennial donor. Now, the other asset is around stocks, right? A lot of this is stock compensation on top of investments. And so that is very, very likely to be a source of gifts from this cohort. So why New York? Why does New York have 14%? Well, a booming stock market has helped investment professionals on Wall Street become well-to-do. Also, things like consultants and lawyers at top firms, as well as a couple other folks. But you can think about actors and celebrities. Those people are so tiny as a percentage that we're really looking at some of these big businesses. Again, the wealth is primary in two assets. Real estate, again, no one is giving you their New York apartment because they need a place to live, but also a lot of stocks and investments, which might be likely to be a source of gifts. Why Massachusetts, Texas, and Washington State? In Washington, it's just as we understand the population here, it's primarily tech. Amazon, Starbucks. Starbucks is not quite tech, but sort of this fast-growing company. Microsoft and Boeing. In Massachusetts, it's also tech, but that tech has a more science bent. So biotech and pharma, and then things like consulting, banking, and law. In Texas, energy, obviously a really big one, banking, law. All of these, by the way, are in major cities. So it's not as though the Washington millionaires are equally spread out, right? They're almost entirely in Seattle, Massachusetts, almost entirely in Boston. In Texas, they're in Dallas, Houston, and Austin. A little bit in San Antonio, but mostly Houston, Dallas, and Austin. So they're all in major cities. Great. So the second insight here is that investing has become a massive focus for this group, especially in the last 12 months. So millennials account for nearly 20% of the stocks market's trades in 2020, up from 10% in 2019. I mean, this is a doubling in 12 months, showing massive interest here. The investing app Robinhood, and now Robinhood, if you don't know what Robinhood is, it's sort of like an E-Trade or Charles Schwab online. It's a little more tailored to millennials. They saw record deposits in the first quarter of 2020, and daily trades were up 300% over the previous year. Other platforms, again, the sort of E-Trades of the world, saw similar growth. So there's a massive shift into investing from this cohort. And a lot of them are picking individual stocks or also things like index funds and mutual funds. Third insight, this is a big difference from previous generations. So wealthy millennials tend to stick together, and to a greater degree than what you saw in previous generations where many would live in many various areas. So millennials are much more urban than previous generations. Right? There's a very big difference. They don't really live in the suburbs to the same degree. And so they're creating these epicenters of wealth and education. Boston, LA, DC, New York, SF, Seattle, Austin, Chicago, a couple other places. But increasingly, your sort of well-to-do affluent millennials are centering in these areas. And this is different than the boomers who would be happy to sort of live here, but also would live in the surrounding states. So I grew up in New Jersey in a bedroom community of New York City, and you had a lot of folks fanning out from New York, but also there were folks sort of all the way into Philly, New Jersey, Connecticut, et cetera, whereas millennials are tighter cohorts. It is not simply being younger. Frankly, cities are much safer places to live than they were 30 years ago. And so you see more draw there as well. Coworkers, especially if you're in some of these areas and you become close to your coworkers, which tends to happen more among this generation, they're on a similar salary and equity trajectory. So you might have friends who are at the same law firm, who are in the same consulting firm, who are at the same tech company. And so you have this cohort of folks that are equally well-to-do because they came in at the same levels. And remember, they're less likely to be married. So in some cases, close friendships are taking on portions of the roles of spouses, where they have that really tight support group that might not have existed if marriage rates were higher. The fourth thing to note, and this is something that actually a lot of gift officers myth. So I really want to point this out here. That incomes are rising quickly. So tech hiring is increasingly competitive, salaries are rising, stocks continue to grow in value. Law, consulting, and banking operate in what's called a tournament model, where each promotion comes with a very large pay increase to foster competition and productivity. So tournament model looks like this, sort of the shape of a tournament, where you have narrower bands at each level, right? So you might have 50 junior associates, 30 senior associates, and then 12 partners. And each of those levels comes with a very large increase in pay. So you'll see the folks that are successful sort of bouncing up very quickly along the income scale. It's specifically designed, it's a strategy designed to foster competition and productivity, which can frankly make some of these places not that pleasant to work at times. But what it means is your millennial donors are growing in giving capacity much faster than older generations. So if you get a $10,000 gift from a 40-year-old and a $10,000 gift from a 70-year-old, you should be much more excited about the first one. Now, why is that? Because someone who can give you $10,000 at 40 can probably give you $20,000 at 43 and $50,000 at 47. Whereas a $10,000 gift from a 70-year-old is probably going to be a $10,000 gift next year and $8,000 gift the year after. So this ascendancy of salary should correlate with an ascendancy of giving, and that's really important. So I hope that makes sense. Feel free to, by the way, add any questions in the chat. Some of my colleagues are tracking them, and we'll look closely to those at the end. All right, so the other insight, big insight number 5, and many of you know this, especially those that are centered on planned giving, is over the next 30 years, an estimated $68 trillion will be passed on as the large and wealthy baby boomer generation ages. Our sense, by the way, is that this number is underreported, and that it may be closer to $100 trillion. And why is that? Because recent stock market growth has grown IRAs and other investments to such a big degree that actually the $70 trillion number is a few years old. So boomers are the massive and wealthiest population. Now, if you're in planned giving, this is a really good opportunity to have some of that go to charity, right? That's a lot of the origin of FreeWill, but it also means a ton of it's going to kids. Now, so by 2030, in 9 years, millennials will hold 5 times as much wealth as they have today. I mean, that's astounding. And so you'll have some millennials who are not well-to-do right now, whose house in the suburbs, who will receive a large house in the suburbs, probably sell it and have far, far more money than they did. Some people are going to become millionaires overnight through an inheritance, and that will be a really big shift. Remember we talked about fertility rates in children. Boomers had way fewer children than their parents did. So, you probably have a sense if you're a baby boomer or if your parents are baby boomers, how many kids were in their family and how many kids are in your family. So my mom is one of 7, and I'm one of 4, and being one of 4 is a very large family among my peers. Being one of 7 was actually a relatively normal situation among her peers. So what that means is that inheritances become more concentrated per child. So in the silent generation, even if they passed out $1 million, it might get split 5 ways. If boomers are passing on $2 million that is getting split 1 way or 2 ways, suddenly you have much wealthier students. The other good news, so some of you, I imagine, are thinking, my nonprofit isn't in Boston, Austin, LA, SF, New York, DC. And so how do I attract these folks? Well, what happens is, remember we said millennials are more concentrated. What that means is that boomers are less concentrated. And so the folks who will inherit money are geographically spread out compared to the high earners. So there will be a shift. So you can think of your own work and say, where are my donors concentrated? Are my millennial donors likely to be the inheritors, right? So if you live in a more rural area, maybe more inheritors. If you're in San Francisco or New York, maybe more high earners. So that's a shift that you should keep an eye on. Someone asked, note dates for silent generation. So this 1945-46, that is the beginning of the baby boom, right? And you can see that big shift. So what happens is a huge number of enlisted men come back from World War II. The way that babies work, babies showed up 9 months later, and you see this huge spike overnight. Silent generation is before that. You can see that real dip, right? Fewer people are having children during the war. They're having fewer children during the Great Depression because they're not sure they can afford to have them. And so you see this really big shift. So silent generation is smaller, actually has some emotional wear and tear, having grown up during war or depression, and so ended up actually being less successful as a generation than the subsequent one, in part because of things like the GI Bill, in part because actually they were just lower risk takers. So really interesting psychology there. We'll go into that another day. All right, so what do we do about this? So big questions here. One is, how are we even going to find these people? You know, how do we figure out who in our database might be the right fit? So if you have a sense of who some of your stronger, frequent donors are, even if you don't, you don't know where they work, you can look them up on LinkedIn, and things like Glassdoor will understand salaries. So if folks are lawyers, if they're in consulting, if they're in banking, you can not just look at salaries on Glassdoor, you can also look at what somewhat more senior titles are to understand where these people might be in 2 or 5 years. So rather than just going to the VPs at Goldman Sachs, you can think about who are the senior analysts right now, knowing that 3 and 4 years down the road, those people are going to be making 3 times as much money as they are right now. So that's really interesting. For tech, you want to look at publicly traded companies. So you can have a mental note of who's working at different companies, but specifically those that are publicly traded, meaning their company is on the stock exchange, NASDAQ or the Dow Jones or something similar. And what that looks like is those are the folks that have what are called liquid stock, right? So if you work at Instacart right now, Instacart is a grocery delivery company, if you don't know it, that company is still private. So it's actually very difficult to donate stock. Once it becomes public, it becomes very, very easy to do so. And so you're looking at these publicly traded companies and what are called recent IPOs or initial public offerings. An IPO just means a company is newly listed on the stock market. So suddenly what was not liquid is now liquid, and it's much more easily donatable. Also things like acquisitions, when a tech company is purchased by a larger company, Facebook, Google, these companies tend to buy a lot of other companies. Suddenly there's much more money for the folks that are working at companies that are being bought, and that might make them new potential donors. So if you're in New York, if you're in Boston, even if you're in Kansas City or Chicago, or places that aren't quite as tech heavy, but there are some startups, you might want to do things like sign up for your local tech and startup newsletter and actually understand what companies are really hot and growing quickly and what aren't. Okay, one other tactic. So you guys can see this mug on the left. When I was in grad school, Facebook ads would show me this all the time. So my parents live in Rhode Island. I was in grad school in California. And they would say, why don't you buy this mug for your mom for Mother's Day? And what you can do on Facebook is advertise by hometown and where people live. So if you are, let's say, a museum in Western Missouri, you may not have a lot of educated, high-income millennials in your town. You may have a lot of folks who were born in your town and raised in your town and still feel very close to it and want that tie to the hometown. But you might think about, how do we advertise even a basic survey or something else to get them interested? They can hear more about it. And if you're scrolling through social media and you see something about your hometown, your response rates will be extremely high. So really interesting tactic there that I think is probably underused. Tip 2, by the way. So we talked about how quickly incomes are growing. You want to get folks in now. So millennial giving capacity will grow quickly. So we need to think about, how do we welcome people into philanthropy? Now, especially for someone who didn't have wealthy parents, this all might be new. And you have a responsibility to teach people what giving is like and how that might be. So when you think about giving circles or gift levels and different levels of recognition, you might want to choose a lower threshold for those under 45 or under 40. So let's say there's a $10,000, the President's Circle or whatever it might be. It's $10,000 a year. Let's think about, if those people are under 40, it's $2,000 a year. And that way they get to meet and mingle with older folks, and older donors really welcome these younger donors. And then you get in the habit of larger and larger gifts. So you can expect that someone who can give $2,000 at 35 can probably give $10,000 at 41, if not more. And so really easing these folks in as opposed to scaring them off. Second thing is our naming opportunities. Now, a lot of you will have naming opportunities, small scholarships, things like that. You want to consider lowering the threshold for those as well. Getting in the habit of that means it'll be harder to give up. Right? It'll be harder to say, I don't really want to do my scholarship anymore, even if that threshold goes up over time. Here's a big thing. Remember how we talked about how many fewer people are married and how there's sort of different closeness among close friends? You might want to invite people to endow a chair, create a scholarship, sponsor a park bench with friends and not just spouses. So plenty of people will have the Mr. and Mrs. Smith scholarship, but you can think about doing that with 3 or 4 classmates or friends or something else as well. And so making sure that that is an option will allow people to have this social experience of giving in a major way as opposed to just sending a credit card or PayPal into your website. So tip 3 is highlighting specific impact. Feeling like their gift, quote, didn't matter is the #1 reason for donor attrition among millennials. It's very easy to feel like we're just throwing money into a black hole, and it's not really clear what happens next. Also, generally not quite as trusting of authority as some older generations. Baby boomers and Gen X, when they give, they're more likely to look for things like testimonials and financial reports. But millennials are seeking out nonprofit impact reports and news stories. Now, tip infographics, by the way, are better than brochures or reports. The amount of stuff that people actually read on the internet is getting less and less over time. So you don't have to justify yourself with a 20-page report. You just have to be able to have some very specific impact. This is also, by the way, more of a feeling than a scientific analysis that millennials are looking for. And so you can highlight one specific thing and be extra clear about it and not feel like you've got to write this exhaustive thing over the course of 3 months. One thing that we've shared in the past that is really, really effective and takes very little time is this thinking of you note. And so I want to share what that looks like from an email perspective. So this is where you would note something specific this person helped to fund. You would then share something you saw in action. And this is especially true during COVID when they might not get to the park or be able to go to the reunion or really see the stuff that they're funding happening. And you want to keep it extremely short so it feels spontaneous and easy. Here's what it looks like in email, subject thinking of you. Sean, I walked by Sam on campus today. She was explaining a geometry concept to another student, and I think doing a good job. I know that scholarship that you, Sarah, and Will, okay, so now we're doing a friend scholarship, is making a big difference to Sam, but I thought you'd like to know it seems to be helping other kids too. Have a great day. So this is a really, really powerful message to get. It's very quick. That feeling of, did my gift have an impact? Well, now I know it definitely made an impact, and I'll probably give twice as much next year. And Sarah, Will, and I, or if I'm Sean, will all talk about how great this made us feel. So one twist here, when we ask you how you communicate with millennial donors, 80% said social media, 75% said email, 25% said direct mail, et cetera. And only about 9% said text. So a couple things here. One, I want you to remember that social media, especially if we're talking about Facebook, that boomers are the largest consumer of that over millennials. So just make sure that when you're communicating through social media, you have that lens and you're not sort of overly anchoring to a younger audience. The other thing is that text messaging is a much better way to reach millennials than people are giving it credit for. It has nearly 100% open rates among millennials. Sometimes people in your position say, wow, that's too unprofessional. I can never text someone. Let me tell you, millennials hate phone calls. So the idea that a phone call is more professional than a text message is not quite correct. And the idea of getting phone calls out of the blue, even among friends, is actually increasingly rare. So gift officers still have it in their head that they can call someone out of the blue, but would never text message. And I would actually say the opposite is true, that you'll get a much higher response rate from text messaging than phone calls. 19% said they never check voicemails. For some reason, voicemails have got so out of style where people might not check voicemails for 3 days, which would never have happened if you got home and your answering machine in 1995 was going off, right? And so this is just a whole big shift. Being comfortable with text messages is really important here. If a friend calls me out of the blue, I assume something is wrong. I mean, that's basically where it is. And that is even more true as you get younger. By the way, some of you might think, well, I have an office phone. I don't want to give up my personal number to a bunch of donors. So you can set up a Google Voice number to text. This is actually free. So feel free to Google it and check it out. But that's free. So you can have your own text line, et cetera, that isn't your personal number. if that makes you more comfortable. And so everyone has their own tolerance there. But definitely don't, the big takeaway here is if you have one-to-one relationships, as you will as a gift officer, text message is super useful. Also, if you're snapping photos of something cool happening at the museum or on campus and send those, that is a very strong, powerful experience, right? It's much better than a phone call. And it's much, also it's the case, by the way, that no one's gonna read your direct mail in this context. Okay, so tip 4, this is, along with text messaging, this is probably the most important thing of this session. So if you've been zoning out, just zoom in for 2 minutes, then you can zone back out. You really, really wanna fix your donate page. So millennials are giving online, they're not giving by check, they don't give by phone, they definitely don't open the mail, okay? So in online giving is going up every year. Partly that's all generations. A lot of it is that all of millennial giving is happening online. The largest gifts you'll receive from millennials are going to be stock gifts. And we know from research that organizations who focus on non-cash gifts grow 6 times faster than people who focus on cash gifts. Okay? It's an enormous shift. It's not a little bit. It is a massive shift that will be the difference between success and failure for a lot of fundraisers. Now, before we get this, why is that true? It's because you get larger gifts from exactly the same people. So the same people that might write you a $100 cash gift might write you a $4,000 stock gift or give you $4,000 in stocks at the same moment. But the risk of sort of less effective fundraisers is that they only ask for cash. And if your fundraising is all sort of email to donate page, this is where it breaks down. And this is where you're getting $30 gifts from millennials instead of $3,000 stock gifts. And that means you're putting less organizational focus on millennials and therefore sort of getting less giving overall, right? So the more that you can lean in here and use your basic donate page to uncover major donors, oftentimes what will happen is one stock gift will be larger than the rest of all of the online giving that day overall. Most nonprofits, though, only talk about giving in things like direct mail or newsletters, right? Sometimes people will say, oh, we included a little bit about planned giving, or we included something about stock giving in our, a little quarter-page ad in our magazine. But the problem is that millennials aren't reading the magazine. Right? They might not even be getting the magazine because they're changing address more often. So just as an example, this is our friend Lakshmi. Lakshmi works at FreeWill. So she's a Harvard grad. She's a world traveler. This photo is from her in Peru. She used to work at Google. Now she works at FreeWill. We probably don't pay her as much as Google did, but we love her and we're so happy to have her. She's an older millennial, by the way. You can note the horizontal selfie. So that's how you know what portion of millennials she's in. And she has a bunch of Google stock because when she was getting paid, she got paid in salary and she got paid in Google stock, and Google stock has been going up pretty considerably. And to her, she says it feels different. It feels like bonus money. Sort of, it's just a different mindset than the paycheck you're getting pretty steadily, where that's going into your budget. And so she preferred to give stock to animal rights and disaster relief. Those are her 2 favorite causes. But before FreeWill, no one had ever asked, and it wasn't obvious on the website, so she ends up giving a much smaller cash gift, right? And this is a very, very common story, and this thing happens there. So Jean asks, how do you get stock gifts through your donate page? So remember that I'll show you that in a moment. Remember that non-cash gifts are much larger from the same donors. And your online donate page is the only way that many of your donors will interact with you. So it gets 10 times or 100 times the traffic of your ways to give page. Too often times people say, oh, we have something on our website. But they don't remember that sort of like a newspaper, the thing that's on the headline, on the front page, probably gets 100 times the eyeballs of something on C37 or C16. And so really thinking about what are the main levers for getting big gifts and putting those front and center instead of burying them is going to result in some dramatically different ways to give. So this is where you want to suggest giving stocks on that page, as well as things like qualified charitable distributions. Again, not for millennials, but overall you want to be moving people away from cash giving whenever you can. Donor advised funds, etc. So any types of non-cash assets that your organization takes, you want people to think about that at the moment they're already ready to give, instead of just giving you 40 bucks. So here's what good looks like. The Southern Poverty Law Center obviously does excellent work in the world. They're also some of the sharpest people in fundraising. And now what you might see is like, this might not actually be the prettiest fundraising page out there, but it's one of the most effective. And so you can see a normal email that they might say, you know, there's a lot of stuff happening in the US right now. Southern Poverty Law Center is at the front lines. You know, click here to chip in to make it all possible. And then on that, they have other ways to give even before you pick out the amount you're going to give. And so there's a tool here that donates stocks or securities. You can do things like make a tribute donation, make a donation from your IRA, etc. So many of you wouldn't have quite as many. You might want to take out PayPal. The SPLC Action Fund is a different legal entity, so most of your organizations wouldn't have that. But a couple of things up here, so people start thinking about giving non-cash gifts, which is also better for your donors, suddenly it's going to result in much larger gifts. So, you know, the danger in a lot of your pages is that your average gift is going to be $40, when you could be getting some $50,000 gifts through that page if you were prompting people in the right way. A lot says we receive a majority of our online donations through PayPal. So in that case, definitely leave PayPal up. All right, so that's a huge thing. So before we get off topic, just make sure this locks in your brain. This is one of the biggest and easiest ways. You fix this page once, you'll have positive results for the next 6 years. So it's not a big effort. On rare occasion, you don't run your own donate page. You just need to write to those people and say, look, this is really important to us. So if you work with an entity that doesn't allow you to do it, but 3 of you write in, trust me, those people will change that process very, very quickly. Okay, tip 5. This is going to be counterintuitive for millennials, but you want to go big on planned giving. So millennials are much more likely to include bequests in their estate plans than boomers and silent generation folks. Now, why is that? Part of it's because they're more charitable, right? We know that there's a bunch of generational changes. We also know that education correlates with being charitable. We also know it's because they have fewer children. And if they're unmarried, even more so. So 50% of people who are unmarried without children who make a will are going to include a bequest in their will. Yes, this money is a long way off. So you might think, why do we do planned gifts for someone who's going to live 50 years? Research shows that people who make a planned gift increase real-time giving by 75%. And what you're doing is you're identifying your die-hard supporters and often their asset levels. So someone who's a millennial says, I left you $150,000 in my estate plans. Part of your brain might say, well, that's cool, but I'm going to be so far retired by the time that money ever shows up, I don't really care. What it means is that we know, A, this person really, really cares about the nonprofit, and B, that person has at least $150,000 that they're going to allocate here. Let's go talk to them and say, you know, if you thought about a $2,000 a year scholarship, if you thought about a $5,000 a year level, if you thought about $20,000. And so this is beginning to have those conversations, and they've already made that commitment. So you can say, I know this seems like this is really important to you. Would you like to talk through some other ways to have impact? And again, for folks who don't have really wealthy parents, it is probably your role to teach these people about the different paths of philanthropy, because it's not something that sort of shows up in high school or college classes. All right, so those are insights and some of the things to do. One bonus insight is that millennials are increasingly turning to donor-advised funds. So 79% of DAF donors are over 50, right? So most of them are older, but 13% of DAFs opened in 2019 were by millennials. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of donor-advised funds. Part of this shift is that workplaces are now adding donor-advised funds as a perk. So pre-tax money can go into DAFs. So there's a whole bunch of strategies that we'll walk through next week at this time on how to work on donor-advised funds, not just for millennials, but overall. And so we historically think of donor-advised funds as something that's only the realm of older donors. In fact, there are smaller donor-advised funds that are being tweaked to now be really appropriate for millennials, and we'll walk through a bunch of that next week. So there's a whole bunch of changes happening with donor-advised funds and a whole bunch of new strategies that people need to take while we're operating remotely, and that 2021 is shifting, including some tax language and things like that. So we'll walk through that next week if you feel like joining. So you're welcome. All right, so those are some of our key tips. A couple of resources available next Thursday. Yes, say the 12th. This Thursday, January 14th at 1 p.m. in 2 days. Feel free to join. We'll walk through how some other of the savviest nonprofits are using different technology for planned and major giving, and share some case studies. So that's always fun. It's pretty quick. Feel free to bring your lunch. Nice and easy. And then secondly, just a reminder, please fill out the survey. I think my colleague Simone is going to drop a link in the chat. She'll probably do it again because there's so many people here today. So we'll do that. Just make a note in the survey if you'd like us to send you a copy. Tell us where to send it. If I can wrangle a couple more copies out of our CFO, we'll send even more. And mostly this is just so that you have a really, really wonderful year. And I know there's some big things coming to a lot of you. So we're going to take a 60-second break now. So I'm going to read all the questions and figure out which ones we can answer. Please take this minute. It would mean a lot to me if you can just fill out the survey, tell us what went well, and on a 1 to 5 scale, what we should change. So please do that now. And I'm just going to collect my thoughts on some of these questions. Miriam asks, by the way, how to register for the Thursday class. If you just fill out the survey, we'll make sure to send you actually that Thursday session, there's just a quick question in the survey. So just make a quick note and we'll add you the calendar invite and the Zoom link. So very easy, just click yes. Also, the survey is the best way to make sure that you get a follow-up with the recording and the slides in case you want to share with other folks at your company. Great. All right, so we will, let's do some questions. So please fill out the survey. This is the next webinar, but let's get to a bunch of questions. Then hopefully we'll give everyone a little bit of time before whatever their 1 o'clock or noon or 11 or 10 a.m. meeting, depending on your time zone. One question is, due to working remotely, will this change to more rural? So Hal asked this. This is a question of, do we expect the where of where millennials are to shift with more and more increase? So what we're seeing is that banking and big law are not really shifting in terms of people moving. What we are seeing is tech. And now, where are people moving? It is not moving more rural. Right? What we're seeing is large shifts. People have a strong affection for urban areas. We are seeing shifts from high tax states, primarily New York, excuse me, and California, into lower tax states. So there's a very big pipeline right now moving from San Francisco to Austin, potentially from New York to Florida. If you're in Texas or Florida, in some Washington state is actually already a non-income tax state. You'll see a little bit of shift to Nevada, but more likely that Austin will be a destination for a lot of tech. And so you're seeing companies move their headquarters. It won't shift the urban-rural divide. It will shift some of the states. So that will be big. It just seems that there's a communitarian. Now, why are people actually living in cities instead of rural areas compared to previous generations? One, cities are safer. Two, a lot of sort of technology and conveniences start in cities. So things like food delivery and other conveniences. 3, remember, we're having fewer children and getting married later. So the idea that you're moving to the suburbs for a bunch of space isn't really a thing if you don't have children. So a bunch of the factors that drove urban flight into the suburbs and the exurbs, and really the sort of car-owning mentality of baby boomers has shifted, where a surprising number of 35-year-olds I know don't have automobiles, and not just in New York City, which my parents knew nobody at 35 who didn't have a car. They were just totally unable to afford it. How often, let's see. Amanda said, aren't fewer millennials using Facebook? That's correct. So if you think about targeting millennials on, email is better, text message is better. If you're using social media, don't just write a cool story, actively engage with folks. If someone just gave you a gift, or you can sort of tag photos of people in your place, that is much better than just a static story that is just broadcast. So think of social media as an interactive platform as opposed to a broadcast medium. There are a couple questions on how do you ask for non-cash gifts? What does focusing on it look like? Can you confirm what stock giving is again? So we skipped over this quickly. We've covered it in previous sessions. Stock giving, just as a reminder, is for most people by far the best way to give because you save on two types of taxes. If you donate stock to an organization, you don't pay any capital gains and you get a full federal income tax deduction. And in some cases you save on state income tax and you get a state income tax deduction in some cases as well. So if you're a wealthy person in California, you can save up to 70 or even 80% of your gift in taxes, which makes it a hugely valuable way to give and results in much larger gifts. So one of the things in the survey actually is that we've created a masterclass in stock giving. It's about an hour. It's worth 1.5 CFRE credits. Feel free to sign up for that. We'll send you the link. I think it's free for the next few days. Eventually it'll be sort of only for FreeWill partners, but it's a pretty, Angie says that stock class is excellent in all caps. Thank you, Angie. That is very, very kind. Anne says, I've heard that in another webinar that millennials like to receive direct mail, but you're saying the opposite. Can you confirm? And what we've seen is that across the board response rates are down for direct mail from millennials compared to previous generations. Part of it is they're just less used to getting mail, so they don't really check it with the same intent. And the assumption is that anything comes in the mail is junk. The other thing is that we actually don't have checkbooks to the same degree. So your sort of direct response envelope stuff usually requires checks where everything is credit card or Venmo or PayPal. So that was a really big shift. Anne also says, we have a ways to give page as well as a give page. Are you suggesting there should be only one? That's not what I'm suggesting. And you do want to have a more exhaustive ways to give page for people who are actively hunting down, how might I give real estate to this organization? What I'm saying is that your give page should be optimizing for getting the biggest gifts instead of just getting only a bunch of small cash gifts. And therefore on your give page, which is, think about the give page as if you're sending an email out with one link, where does that link go? That should go to a page that has multiple options because the options that you're not putting there right now will result in much larger gifts than the options you are putting. So you're basically risk cramming down your major donors into annual giving donors, even though these are the people who are most motivated. So you really want people at the moment when they're most motivated to give to think about, wow, maybe I should give a $10,000 gift from a couple hundred shares of Apple stock compared to writing a $120 check. And that's really key. And it's not just because you want that money, you've now uncovered a new major donor who can be stewarded for the next 10, 12, 50 years. So this is really important. Is PayPal still a big way that people choose to donate? Yes, I think it's sort of equal, not equal with credit cards, but I wouldn't take it off your page unless you have really good information about it. Let's see. Carmen asks, millennials are more charitable, but what have you seen that shows which charities they donate, focusing on social causes, religion, higher ed? So one of the biggest shifts, frankly, is that religious organizations tend to be getting fewer donations from millennials, which also correlates with lower overall attendance at things like church and synagogue. Now, it doesn't mean that people who are going are giving less. It just means that there are fewer people going among millennial generations. It is probably the case that if you are a Catholic diocese, a Baptist foundation, synagogue in a major city, you do want to continue to engage millennials. Your biggest donations will be coming from older folks, and planned giving is actually one of the things that's going to sustain a lot of religious communities for a very long time. So if you are running a religious organization, I would say this is, you saw that curve and that $68 trillion, your first step is tripling down on planned giving right now with a focus on older donors. Is stock giving increasing for nonprofits that aren't C3s? Jacqueline asks, yes, it's for C4s also because you can avoid capital gains. You don't get an income tax deduction because gifts to C4s are not tax deductible in the same way. If you work at a C4, you totally understand what we mean. If not, don't worry about it. But that's a big shift. All right, so let's pause there. Feel free to add any other questions. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have any other questions. But I want to make sure everyone has a little bit of time before your next big event. Thank you so much for joining and spending an hour with us. I'm really excited about the year ahead for this community, for a lot of your work. I know that that surviving 2020, both personally and professionally, was a pretty big achievement. So I know that many of you are dealing with family, working from home while teaching at home, or looking after older parents, or different economic circumstances and stuff like that. So just huge kudos to all of the work you're doing, and for continuing to get smarter and better at it. So just a big thank you, both from me, but also from Magda and Simone at FreeWill who are on, from Jenny, and from our whole team over here for everything you're doing. So look forward to seeing you next Tuesday if you want to dive in on donor advised funds. I've already learned a lot in the research, so hopefully it's really insightful to everybody else. So take care and talk to you all soon.